Hello, my name is Michael Gargano, and welcome to this special interview with an EMDR badass, Dr. Jamie Marich.
Thank you, Michael, for having me.
If you want to introduce yourself for our audience.
So I am Jamie Marich. Thank you for correctly pronouncing it in Croatian, although most people know me as Jamie Marich, who follow my work in English. I'm the author of EMDR Made Simple, EMDR Therapy and Mindfulness for Trauma-Focused Care. I'm the co-author of that book. The writer, Anna David, gave me the title EMDR Badass, so I give her that shout out. And most recently, I'm the author of the revised and expanded edition of Trauma and the 12 Steps, which is out July 2020 with North Atlantic Books.
So tell us what inspired you to write Trauma and the 12 Steps.
Well, whenever I'm asked this question, I really have to go back to the beginning, which is when I wrote the first edition, which I also understand you have a copy of sitting beside you. So the first edition came out in 2012. And it was a book that I really felt was one of the great ideas of my heart that I had to get out there. And weirdly, no publisher wanted it because it was such a hybrid book written for both a professional and a recovery audience. I liked to say that first book was written both for counselors and for sponsors. And it took a very pro 12-step approach while also taking a very pro-trauma approach. I was mentored initially in recovery by a woman who did both. She was my first sponsor, but she also understood quite a bit about trauma. And I ended up having a really amazing experience in 12-step recovery. And I have stayed a part of a 12-step fellowship for 18 years because the steps were delivered to me in a way that was truly trauma-focused, trauma-informed. And I've always been a fan of the 12 steps, yet I have fielded a lot of the criticism that people have made of the 12 steps, and a lot of it is legitimate. A lot of it I agree with based on how I've seen the 12 steps presented in treatment centers, certain treatment centers, and of course in the community. So in, I don't know, about 2010, I had really started lecturing more nationally. And people were giving me the feedback that I had a good sense of doing the both and, that we can still use 12-step recovery, it's still helpful. And we also need to look at what we've learned about trauma since 1935. And the more I got that feedback, it struck me that we really have to do a book here. And the publisher I'd been working with at the time did not want the 12-step focus. And another publisher I found liked the 12-step focus, but they really wanted to make it a purely clinical book. And that was not my aim because I wanted sponsors and regular folks in recovery to be able to buy this for 10 or 15 bucks. So I made the decision at that point to go ahead and publish it independently. And knowing that that was a risk, but I truly felt this had to be done in a way that promoted this bridge building, in a way that promoted this both and that really defines my work. So it came out in the summer of 2012. And it ended up being a really good decision because it's probably the book I'm most known for in recovery circles anyway. And I ended up meeting very many good friends and contacts who work with me very closely now through that book. And I knew at some point it would need a reboot, it would need an update because even more has progressed in our study of trauma since 2012. There was more things I wanted to say since the first book. And so I'm very grateful that North Atlantic Books, which is a really well-known publisher of just some progressive trauma material, that they picked it up. And here it is in this revised and expanded edition.
Thank you for that. And I think if I'm hearing you correctly, some of the criticism of the 12-step approach is often cited as rigidity.
Yes.
And that doesn't seem to work in a trauma-informed care. So can you tell us a little bit about what it takes to be trauma-informed and what that term means?
Sure. So trauma means wound. If you're looking for the quick and easy definition, trauma comes from the Greek word meaning wound. And yes, we can get into more clinical definitions of diagnoses like post-traumatic stress disorder, dissociative disorder, which have trauma at their root. But in a really basic sense, trauma is an unhealed wound. And if we understand and appreciate this broader definition of trauma, we've all been wounded in some way. And the issue really becomes, have the wounds been given a chance to heal or not? Because some people can go through traumatic experiences, traumatic events, and not end up developing addiction, not end up developing complications, usually because the wound has either been addressed or they've had some kind of inherent or learned system of coping that has helped them to heal the wound. So when we're talking about clinically significant trauma or trauma that gets in the way of a person's life, yes, it's those unhealed wounds, but specifically those unhealed wounds that really exist in an area of our brain that we can't quite get to just by talking. Because for many, many years, the psychotherapeutic professions really tried to treat trauma with just more of a talk approach, more of a cognitive approach, and found it to be futile. That yes, it might help with some of the initial coping. It might help you to hold your proverbial shit together for periods of time, but to really get to that kind of core of our brain where so much of this material remains unprocessed, requires an understanding of concepts like what I just discussed, that you can't just talk it out. And so something that I discuss in the book, for instance, is how some of the 12-step slogans that we have honored as time-tested slogans, like think, 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 or think the drink through, really aren't very helpful, because if I could think it away, I wouldn't have an addiction in the first place, let alone be able to manage it as it comes up. So the treatment of trauma is really more about getting into feeling and being in the body. And I've set out to really help recovering leadership understand that. And by recovering leadership, I mean either people who work in professional treatment centers or people who might be mentors, sponsors, senior members of recovery fellowships that are not necessarily professional. So fundamentally, being trauma informed is understanding what trauma is and how it impacts human behavior. And how when a person is being stuck or stymied due to an unhealed trauma, they may have a hard time discerning the wisdom to know the difference, because the wisdom to know the difference is more of a function of the more rational brain, the more cerebral brain. And we can't access that brain. We can't access those functions when we're in this state of what's sometimes called amygdala hijack, or when the limbic brain is overactivated, or quite frankly, when we're paralyzed in what might be a fight, flight, or freeze response.
Reptilian brain.
Yeah. And again, there's discussion and controversy now over what exactly we're calling these aspects and parts of the brain. But we've traditionally understood it as that the human brain has a more rational brain that's top down, and a more kind of animal driven, survival driven brain that's more bottom up. And it gets very hard to just be rational when this more emotional brain is still largely unhealed. So just using some very practical examples in the book, because some professionals might have more ability to understand some of the the neuroscience, some of the professional content. But for sponsors, especially, I've tried to set very clear examples. Like, have you ever tried to talk reason when someone's in crisis? And I always say when I teach, I could admit I've tried. It has never worked. And it's because of just having a basic understanding of how trauma impacts human behavior. That's what it means to be trauma informed. Another practical example I use is, have you ever asked someone who relapsed, what were you thinking?
Doesn't always work.
Yeah, because thinking had nothing to do with it. It was a purely survival-driven type of response that we can only really treat and address with more feeling and body and experience-based interventions. And then a third example I like to use is, have you ever tried to talk reason to somebody who's newly in love or newly in lust? Doesn't really work. Because again, the more rational parts of the brain, sometimes it's described as they can be shut down, but really it's kind of thinking of it as they're not optimally online when the more emotional brain or the more survival driven functions of the brain are kind of ruling a person. And so there's just so much content we go into to try to use examples in the book to help anybody who's in recovery understand why some people may have a hard time getting it. So
one of the salient points I think you make in the book is the Daniel Siegel model, where you have this fist that represents your brain, and addiction is really the flipping of the lid, and it's living in this limbic activation. So I think for a lot of people, in recovery and in the treatment world, we fail to really understand that trauma or the wounds are really the gateway drug. And I think you drive that home pretty clearly in your book.
And through so much of my work, I have really emphasized that the wound metaphor is the key to understanding trauma healing. Because if you think about physical wounds and how they heal, we often need to treat physical wounds from the outside in. Like I cut my finger the other night in the kitchen slicing vegetables, and it was a bloodbath in there. And
Hmm.
I had to wash it out. I had to put a compress on it. I had to change the Band-Aid a couple times to at least get it to scab. But now that it's not in that short-term bleeding phase, I have it out and aired so that it could do its healing work from the inside out. Because wounds truly need to heal from the inside out in a biological perspective. And we can look at that with the brain in whatever model you're using to understand the brain, that we have to heal from the inside out. And so much of what treatment and interventions out there do is just do things from the outside in. And that's not all bad, because as I said, with treating my cut, you often need to stabilize from the outside in using interventions like talk, getting to know each other, but not trying to talk too much reason. It's more about just some basic education, setting a safe enough presence with that person, more insight oriented, the connection of one human helping another, which is so much of what we do in 12-step. And all of those are fantastic strategies for stabilizing a wound. But if that's all you do, it's essentially just putting a Band-Aid on it over and over and over again. And what I'm really calling us to do as a treatment community, or as those interested in really healing the wounds of addiction, is we have to get to the root of the problem, which for so many of us is unhealed trauma and unhealed dissociation.
Well, and I think to that point too, you make a very clear, you're clearer in the second edition that both mental health and addiction professionals on opposite sides of the spectrum really have severed the relationship to one and the other. And it's about getting clear at this point about, we have to address one, you have to address the other. And really it's about wounding, as you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
So what's helped you
Yeah,
to get more clearer in this revised edition than you were in the first one? Because you take a lot more risks.
I do. And thank you for noticing that. Uh, Part of it is just 7 additional years of recovery, 7 additional
Mhm.
years of experience as a writer. Because even last year, when I was going back and updating the portions of the chapters that stayed in, because the original 10 chapters are in there, just updated a bit. I remember reading them thinking, wow, you were very tentative with some of this writing, because I didn't want to step on too many toes, or I
Mhm.
maybe didn't have the fullness of understanding with it yet. And so, yeah, I certainly take more risks. And one of I think it's the first or second line of the second edition, I directly make the contention that if we're going to solve this crisis of addiction, we have to learn how to build bridges and not walls. And obviously, there's been a lot of rhetoric in our American society about building walls lately, in these last several years. And I unfortunately see that in treatment communities and healing communities, because we, even as clinical professionals who are supposed to be the helpers here, can get into our own silos about what we think works best. And so probably the biggest fissure that you've pointed out is between addiction care and mental health care, or specifically trauma mental health care. Because even within the mental health field, you have those of us who are really kind of trauma advocates looking at more holistic solutions for healing trauma. And you have people who are still more cognitively minded, even in the treatment of mental health. So you have those fissures and those silos that turn out. But yeah, it's always mystified me that, like, we have 2 credentials for addiction professionals and mental health professionals. That the way the fields historically developed, addiction was kind of this thing over here that was treated, and mental health was this thing over here that was treated. And where I have kind of long existed as a professional figure, because I've been a therapist now for 16 years, I've been in recovery for 18, that people on the addiction side of the field have long criticized me for worrying too much about trauma. That you're and there's a story I tell in the book about my first clinical director who told me that I was overcomplicating matters by talking too much about trauma. That until people realized that they were addicts and they had a disease and they had to treat that disease, that you're just muddying the waters looking too much at trauma or mental health. And that really represents a very old school reading of AA in the most traditional sense, that really worked with this idea that mental health had somehow failed us. But I would add that even Bill Wilson, the founder of AA, in the text that is Alcoholics Anonymous, advocated that, yes, we may need outside help. There are doctors and psychiatrists who can certainly help us, that just don't drinking and going to meetings isn't the only part of the solution here. So then on the mental health side of things, especially on the more kind of trauma-informed mental health side of things, Michael, there are still people, other leaders in the field who don't think much of me because I advocate for the 12 steps. Because there's a lot of 12-step backlash. There's been a lot of 12-step backlash culturally. New York Times ran a huge op-ed last year, for instance, about it. A lot of this criticism, especially like in the Me Too era and in the era of the opiate crisis, we've learned more about what doesn't work about 12 steps. And so, yeah, with a lot of that 12-step criticism, many people in mental health look at me kind of, 12 steps, it doesn't make sense. I even did an interview here a couple of weeks ago, and I think that's how it started, where the more mental health driven interviewer had this attitude of how are you caught up in the 12 steps? And I explained how, for me, it is a both and that's always how it was presented to me from when my first sponsor worked with me. And to me, this is the dream of what it could be, of different systems working together, most notably the mental health system, specifically the trauma-focused mental health system, together with addiction recovery professionals.
And I think you're naming it without saying it explicitly, but there's this fear of trauma and the phobia of the body in a lot of addiction treatment, and then the fear of addiction in a lot of mental health treatment. And so I think you get a little bit more clearer in the second edition about saying we have to talk about these issues. This is no longer two silos. It now has to be one.
Yeah, and even as you're saying that, I'm thinking of an old client of mine who used to love to say, people fear what they don't understand. Mm-hmm. I've often added to that by saying people fear what they can't understand, or people fear what they haven't worked on themselves. There's a story I tell in the book from really one of the leading mothers of gender responsive treatment and being more trauma informed in addiction care, and that's Stephanie Covington, who wrote A Woman's Way Through the 12 Steps. And I had a chance to meet her in passing years ago, and one of her collaborative partners was an endorser on the book. And when I heard Stephanie give this keynote, she was sharing a story about in the early 80s as a professional going to an addiction conference, and she gave a presentation on sex and violence and addiction treatment. And after giving the presentation, she said she was bombarded with fellow professionals saying, our clients aren't ready to deal with that. How dare you even go there? You're going to make them worse. And she reflected that what she heard in their voices, what she saw in their affect, what she sensed in their vitriol was them saying, we're not ready. We're not ready to go there with our clients because we haven't gone there ourselves. And I think that is a huge problem. A huge, huge problem, obviously, on the addiction side of things, but I can see it on the mental health side of things too, where there's a hesitancy to go there about addiction and dissociation because people haven't addressed their own issues with it. Because I think there's such stigma around what it means to be an addict. Yet another issue I tend to take on in the book is, aren't we all addicted to something? Or haven't we all been addicted to something? Or can we all frame our experience as being in recovery from something, especially if we're defining addiction as really just a sense of maladaptive attachment? What are those things we've developed maladaptive attachments to that keep us from going within, that keep us from doing the work we need to do in the here and now and present in order to heal?
And even to that point, even within the EMDR world, there is this division. Don't start EMDR with someone who doesn't have a year, wait till they have 3 months, start EMDR right away. So it is kind of this ongoing debate, even within multiple contexts, about what do people with addictions deserve. And I think what I like about the trauma-informed 12 steps is you're saying it's a both and approach. Yes, we need to stabilize people, but we don't have the luxury of time. And people are suffering in the middle.
Correct.
And I also think, a big piece of the trauma-informed steps that you write about is that it's not path specific, that you're not saying, you're not rigid in the sense that the 12 steps are the only way. And these are principles to keep going for life. Anyone can really use them.
And thank you for noticing that, Mike, because an approach I take in this book that is fundamentally a pro 12-step book is that the 12 steps aren't for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And I embrace viable alternatives or viable paths that people have been able to work with to bring them what they're looking for. Just like when I teach on EMDR therapy. I mean, you know as well as anybody who knows my work that I love EMDR. I'm a huge fan of it, but I'm also not that person who gets up there when I teach and says, this is a panacea. Like, you all have to learn this. Everybody needs EMDR. I mean, I do think everybody needs to work on their stuff. I do think doing that through a trauma-informed lens will ultimately heal the world. But I also know there are fine other approaches besides EMDR that helps people to do that.
Yeah, and I think a big piece of your work is a lot about choice, and this idea that we have to give people options to go back to, the addiction treatment or the mental health treatment that I learned in graduate school, which is very cookie cutter. You use this modality for this issue and this one for another. Addiction, mental health, trauma, it's not cookie cutter. It severs people in different ways. So I think this both and approach is a very dialectical, DBT-esque approach that I think you're taking that's equally important and valuable in our field and in the lives of people that are seeking recovery that don't want this rigid approach.
Thank you for noticing that. To me, the opposite of rigidity is having a sense of flexible structure. And for me, flexible structure also honors what it means to be both and. Because I know I needed structure to get sober. I know I've needed structure at various points in my recovery to work on things. That consistency and structure are really very healing, especially since so much of my illness is defined by growing up in a lot of inconsistency. So that is of course important. And I share many examples in the book about how lifestyle change is incredibly important when you're on a recovery path, and how doing small things to bring structure into your life is a good thing. But you can't be dogmatic with people. You can't be dogmatic with yourself. There is a degree of flexibility that is required here in order to navigate the waters, if you will, navigate the waves. And there's that teaching, it's often attributed to Bruce Lee, but it actually goes back a lot older than Bruce Lee and in Japanese philosophy, that notice that the tree that is the stiffest is most easily cracked by the wind. But look at like a bamboo, for instance, or a palm tree, that because it has strong roots, but a flexibility, it's really able to withstand the storm.
Yeah, and withstanding the storm is a process. And I think it takes the willingness, honesty, and open-mindedness that is ingrained in the 12-step approach to really open oneself up to the fact that people can form roots, and we won't destabilize people by opening up these traumatic networks. So what's changed in your approach over the last 18 years to help you become more effective in dealing with the both and the criticisms that you've had?
So the piece of direction I got in the early days of recovery that has saved my life, and it inspires a lot of how I work with others, is when Janet, my first sponsor, heard a little bit of my story and my background. She said, Jamie, after everything you've been through, it's no wonder you turned out alcoholic. It's no wonder you turned out addicted. So what now? What are you going to do about it now? What's the plan? And for me, that represented the very essence of validating someone and then challenging them. And too often we get it backwards. We challenge people before we first validate where they're coming from. And I tend to see an excess of both extremes that is fundamentally helpful to no one. That on the addiction side of treatment and some rigidities I see in 12-step communities, there can be this tendency towards tough love. Do, this is what you got to do. I don't want to hear any excuses. I don't want to hear your story, anything of that nature. And on the trauma side of things, I can hear almost an excess of compassion. And don't get me wrong, I'm a fan of compassion. But I also think that too much compassion, absent boundaries and absent bringing people some actionable solutions here for structure is not good either. So we really do need the balance of validating and then challenging, but I believe strongly it has to come in that order. And I know what's helped me in the last 18 years is it's not just been Janet, my first sponsor, but I've had the good fortune of working with other sponsors, especially my current sponsor, who takes a similar approach with me, and other very gifted treatment professionals. I mean, I've still remained in some kind of counseling for most of these 18 years. It hasn't been consistent the whole way out, and I don't go every week, but I do go for my tune-ups. Because I believe part of what recovery has taught me is that I'm a work in process. I'm a work in progress, and healing, especially these very, very deep wounds, may need to happen over time. Also with the recognition that, hey, guess what? Life's going to keep wounding you. Even if you have healed a lot of the core traumas, things are still going to happen. Look at the reality we're in right now with this crazy world. So it's being able to use what you've learned. And to me, that's what structure has taught me. But I also need to be surrounded by friends like you and people in my professional network who understand that I am a human being. And I'm not going to be this perfect recovering person at all times. And I do have a lot of emotion and sensation that needs to be expressed in as healthy possible way. But to the essence of your question, I will say that a lot of what I developed 18 years ago, and I would even say 19 years ago, because it took me a year to really experiment with this stuff before I got sober. A lot of those same foundations are what I still do today. So a story I tell in the book, it's a well-known story for people who've heard me teach before, is when I was first trying to get sober, Janet advised that I pray every morning for help staying sober. And I never stopped believing in God. I was angry at God. That's how I know I never stopped believing in God, because there was a lot of anger and vitriol there. So, I mean, I credit 12 Steps for helping me renegotiate my relationship, certainly, with my higher power. But Janet recommended that I pray to God every morning. And I said, Janet, I am lucky if I get out of bed, maybe go to the bathroom, maybe take a shower. I can't do this prayer routine every morning before I go to work. And she said, oh, you go to the bathroom. Well, why don't you take this 24-hour book? And she handed me the 24 hours a day book, the reader, and she said, put it on your toilet seat. And that way, she said, you go to the bathroom, right? Maybe you'll pick up that book, and while you're sitting there doing your thing, maybe you'll do this reading, which has a prayer at the end. And so she challenged me to do it every day for 30 days. And it truly became a habit and a part of my lifestyle. And even all these years later, I cannot start my morning without reading something spiritual. I don't have to put it on the toilet seat anymore. It's by my bedside now. And for a lot of years, it was just on the top of the toilet. But it was something very small and actionable, but it really got me in the habit of starting my day right, starting my day in as grounded as possible a place. So yes, even though I've gone on to do sophisticated treatments like EMDR and NET and yoga therapy and a lot of expressive arts work, so much of why I can do that is because I have the rootings in practices like the one Janet showed me, in practices like making gratitude lists, keeping a God box or a God list in my journal, in practices like being able to reach out when I need help. As Bill sees it, another great reader. I think I used that one after the 24-hour book.
Yeah, and I think I heard a speaker once say this, and I can't remember who, the problem is not in your mind, but the answer is. And I think you talk a lot about your dissociation and how complex trauma really has been your ticket to freedom, which a lot of people have not viewed that, but understanding of the dissociative mind and the complexities of what trauma did, we can look at that as woe is me, which I think a lot of people think of trauma treatment as giving someone an excuse, or why me? What about me do I need to learn so I can move on and have this more adaptive, healthy, functional life that has meaning and purpose? Can you speak to how dissociation plays into addiction recovery?
Oh, I'm glad you went there, because I was just thinking we got to talk about dissociation, because I think it's even more misunderstood than trauma. So dissociation, if we're going to word origin, means to sever or to separate. And how the general public most knows dissociation is this tendency people have to kind of zone out, check out, blank out, not be here. One of my favorite movie examples of dissociation is in the 2000 film 28 Days with Sandra Bullock in rehab. She writes a letter to her boyfriend saying that whole here but not here feeling will be easier to get with a little bit of chemical assistance. Love, Gwenny. And I think that for many of us who grow up in stress or trauma, our brains teach us how to go to that here but not here place very quickly as a means of survival. And for me, it was a lot of zoning out. It was a lot of daydreaming. I was often told, Jamie Nicole looks like she's been beamed in the head with a fastball. And that was a clear example that I was dissociating even as a child. And a lot of my story also involves developing dissociative parts that formed alongside different traumatic experiences at different ages, because my brain just couldn't take it all. And those younger aspects of myself really have stayed with me. At first, it was in a way that really tortured me. But now I've learned through therapy and healing to use those younger parts of myself to really be like my team that's with me, giving me direction. But the link between dissociation and addiction is, I think, really quite simple. So when I was 2 years sober, it was 2004, and that was the year I started my full graduate internship. Was working in a counseling program, had an internship at an adolescent child mental health facility. And I found that I was just being excessively triggered there. And I found the kids enjoyable to work with, but it was the way I saw the system treating the kids that really bothered me. And I had a coworker who was friendly enough with me to do a bit of an intervention, saying, you're checking out all the time. It's just all over your face. And at that point, it made a lot of sense that, well, I had 2 years free from the chemicals, but a lot of this dissociative tendency to separate was still there. And for a lot of years, I couldn't distinguish what was the chemicals and what was this tendency to dissociate. So one of the models that I'm working on in some of my professional development, and I write about it in Trauma and the 12 Steps, and another ICM team member and I, Adam O'Brien, are working on it further, is this model that directly calls addiction a dissociative issue. And I think that's an idea that's been common sense to a lot of people who know dissociation. But what we're saying in this work is that for children who are traumatized, especially on a very chronic level, dissociation becomes the norm. So much so that our brains become dependent on it. We become bonded to it, if you will. And then once a chemical is introduced into the equation, whether it be a chemical, whether it be a drug, whether it be a reinforcing behavior that creates the dopamine response, what that is doing is amplifying that already familiar experience of the dissociation. And it just makes it worse, makes it more problematic, makes it more maladaptive. So when people get sober, it's really a matter of that whatever path they're using, the unhealed trauma and dissociation has to be addressed as part of it. Because if it's not, problems either will continue to form, like I experienced at 2 years, or a person's not even going to meet their recovery goal or intention in the first place.
Yeah, and I think to that point, a lot of treatment facilities and group leaders would say, Joe is zoning out, Lucy is not paying attention in group. And I think you take that point on in the book. Is that really their resistance to treatment, or are they traumatized and their brain is in survival mode? Which I think a lot of places, particularly where I've worked in the past, have not had this dissociation trauma-informed approach. So taking this work to say, what do you think about this? How do we address dissociation in a group setting? Because group may not be for every client. How do you give someone choice and not say, that's an excuse, but really, how do we meet their needs? And I think you address that in your book.
Yeah. And in my perfect world, group treatment is used for skill building. Maybe a little bit of light education, but I think so many of the problems that happen in treatment center groups is we try to take on too much in a group without having adequate skills for people in the group to either stabilize or ground themselves when they are getting triggered. I remember over the years, I've gotten plenty of referrals from the local treatment centers as an EMDR therapist. Help, they can't sit still in group. And my response is, of course they can't stay still in group, because they're getting activated as all get out by what other people are talking about, not even their own material. And I mean, I think that is potentially one of the benefits of group, right? That we can notice what others are saying or sharing and be inspired to work on it ourselves. But if you're outside of your affective window to do that work, you're going to shut down. So I always say when I train treatment professionals, even if you have to follow a group model in your setting, can you at least start with skills and end with skills? And let that skill training be an example for teaching people that, hey, this is when I'm getting activated and may need to use one of these skills. It could be something as simple as rubbing the hands together. It can be something as simple as clenching and releasing, doing some butterfly tapping, tapping the feet, doing some breath strategies while you're sitting there listening to others. This is an excellent pressure point right here on the breastbone, for instance. And I cover all these in the book. That you can do even when you are in a group setting or a meeting setting or at a family gathering potentially, and being very strongly activated.
Well, and you have a lot of resources available online if you want to just tell listeners where they could find some of these strategies.
Yes, please visit traumamadesimple.com. So that website, traumamadesimple.com, was actually birthed in 2012 when the original Trauma and the 12 Steps came out. I wanted to set up essentially a one-stop shopping for resources, videos, articles that people could get for free online, especially if they can't afford a book, or to at least have a video reference to material that I cover in the book. And then in 2014, I wrote a book called Trauma Made Simple, which was for a little bit more of a generalist audience. And then I ended up changing the title of the website at that point just to be Trauma Made Simple, because it's a simple name to remember. And yes, everything that I've done that you can access online is there. Many different meditation strategies, breathing strategies, just little life hacks, I like to call them, coping skills using the body-mind complex. I have a trauma-informed yoga series on there, some yoga nidra recordings on there, and as well as a lot of articles and interviews. And I'm sure I'll link this fine interview up there too.
And I highly recommend it to anybody who's looking to integrate this mindfulness-based approach into whatever 12-step or recovery approach that they're looking forward to. Another point I wanted to kind of tackle that you get stronger in the second edition is diversity issues.
Yes.
That, you know, the 12 Steps was produced predominantly by 2 white men, and it stayed that way for a number of years. And that issue has created some of the friction that people trying to apply the 12-step approach. So can you comment on that and tell us a little bit about, you know, how we can take more of a diversity lens and trauma-informed?
Yeah. And the first thing I want to say is no disrespect to the crusty old white men who created AA, Bill Wilson and Bob Smith, because I think they tapped into one of the great healing mechanisms of our time, which is the power of one person helping another. And the fact that they were able to do it as men, I do think is a big deal, particularly because men have long been socialized not to show feelings and not to connect in a friendship level with other men. But I do think over the years, as meetings have developed, especially in areas that, let's say, are predominantly Christian or maybe a little bit more middle or upper class, there's been a lot of intolerance for just other types of people. Because, and what breaks my heart about that is I do not believe that is what Bill or Bob intended, particularly with their language of higher power or God as you understand God, that there is a flexibility in that structure that's allowed. But for instance, especially in the US, we see more Christian, more Bible belty parts of the country get more insistent about God and prayers, and it's very often the subtext there is the Christian God. And in the book, I interview my sponsor's husband, who is an atheist, and he mentions that that's one of the things that bothers him the most is how so many Christian prayers are said at meetings that are not part of the AA program, but it's just been kind of the culture of the area that's brought that in. So I just bring some awareness to that, to get people to try to think about, might we be alienating people by not focusing on the thing it is that we have in common, which is that we're people on this boat of suffering, and we need to be helping each other. And can we create a community of respectful discourse about what we believe or don't believe spiritually, without it having this air of, my God's better than your God.
And I think I hear you saying is, can we live out the principles of the program, which are broad enough to help other people to not suffer anymore? And I think in the appendix at the end of the book, you list some resources like AA Agnostica, and some other, which some people might shrivel and say, that's not my path. But I think, it's really an important piece what you're trying to say, also about sexuality issues, spiritual abuse, religious diversity, that we have to kind of tackle these complexities in order for us to have a well-rounded community.
And somebody that I cite in the book, I've not had the privilege of meeting her really personally. I mean, I've met her in passing at some events, is Nadia Boltz-Weber, who is a very progressive Lutheran pastor, also is an out 12-stepper in long-term recovery. And when I heard her speak at a festival last year, she said, I think our greatest drug of choice as people is believing we're better than other people. And I really call that out. That yes, we do have myriad beliefs and political philosophies and whatever, but is that preventing you from being welcoming to the sick and suffering person who may be walking through the door? So for instance, another issue I tackle in the book is medically assisted treatment, psychedelic assisted treatment, harm reduction, things that are not part of my path. And quite frankly, paths that I do have some concerns about, but I also know that data is showing that there's some promise. And many people have reported that these paths are helping them at least do better in life. So my opinions should never get in the way of me being able to treat a person with dignity who's coming into, especially when we're talking about meeting and fellowship in the community. In treatment centers, we may be a little more justified to talk about, well, this is what we do here. And if this isn't what you're looking for, we may have to get you some other kind of placement here. But yeah, it should never get in the way. Another issue, I mean, like you mentioned, sexuality is what I take on, because people just have even people in recovery can have some horribly religious driven beliefs around sexual diversity, gender diversity, and there is no place for that, period. And I feel very strongly about that because for many reasons, but particularly last year, I lost a very dear friend to suicide who was a gay man, struggled for 20 years to get sober, and he never really fully could because of a lot of church-based shame that he was just never able to shake. And it pains me to think that some meetings he might have gone to might have dug that knife in a little deeper. And he even told me a story once of how at a treatment center, a very Christian-based counselor approached him and just said some things that no professional ought ever say. And he dealt with that within 5-6 years before he died. So we really have to be able to take a good hard look about, is what we believe getting in the way of treating people with dignity? Because if that's the case, it's on us to take a good hard look at that.
Yeah, and thank you for going there. I think a lot of things I've heard you say, even in our conversations before this interview, is the adaptive information processing model. Is it working for me, or is it not serving me? And I think in recovery, especially in the 12-step approach, we have to ask, what's our motivation for saying this? Is it coming from a place of interior wounding? When I'm working with someone doing a 4th step, is my stuff bringing some clout, some judgment into what someone else needs to heal and share from? So I think you make a lot of very salient points in the book about how we have this more socially justice informed perspective and living that out in a very authentic way.
And the other thing I take on, I took it on in the first edition too, but I take it on with a little more force here in the second edition. And I want to mention it on the interview because, Michael, I know you have a really strong social justice bent in your practice and in your heart, is the issue of quote unquote singleness of purpose. And for listeners who aren't sure what that is, that in certain fellowships, especially Alcoholics Anonymous, there can be this tendency to say, well, this is for alcoholics only. So you can't come here and talk about your drug use. And a lot of the reasoning I've heard of that over the years is, well, we don't want a certain element coming to our meetings. And we know what that's code for. And that has to stop.
It's privilege.
It just has to stop. It's privilege. It's totally privilege. And the other reality here is, I mean, I know you may be the unicorn in this area, but there are few pure alcoholics out there who may find help in Alcoholics Anonymous. I mean, it's always been my primary fellowship, even though it was my drug use that caused me problems first. And I am so grateful I had a sponsor who could care less. She could care less about whether I identified as an alcoholic, as an addict. She said, just go to meetings. And then when you hear them talking about alcohol and the drugs apply more, just apply drugs in. And I mean, we have to talk about this because I came in thinking that as long as I didn't do drugs, I could still drink. And so there was, because I was told, like, Jamie, why do you have to do drugs? Can't you just drink? So when somebody told me that, it was like, great, I'll do that. So we have to talk about cross addiction and how these messages interact. And people will say to me things like, well, then you could go to other fellowships for those things. Michael, I'd be going to 25 fellowships probably if I went to.
Well, there are 153 of them.
And there's many, yeah. And there's a lot that have come and gone over the years too. And so sometimes at meetings, I'll introduce myself. Hi, I'm Jamie, alcoholic, addict, codependent, compulsive overeater, etc. in recovery. It's like pick an ism. So yeah, that's an issue I very strongly take on. And the other thing I would challenge, old timers who don't like my message about that, even some young timers who have been rigidly trained and don't like my message about that, read the book, The Story Acceptance is the Answer, previously called Dr. Alcoholic Addict. It is my favorite story in the entire AA Big Book. And I mean, he talks about shooting up in the garage. Mm-hmm. He refers to the drugs as solid alcohol. We go there in our book. And so we have to be able to encourage people in meetings to talk freely and not hide who they are, because my affliction has been long defined as keeping parts of my story hidden. And nobody should have to do that. The issue of people who are on medically assisted treatment not being welcome at meetings, BS, I say. Because the only requirement for membership is a desire to stop drinking, is a desire to whatever that behavior may be. And at open meetings, especially, people, the definition of an open meeting is that we're trying to welcome people who aren't sure yet. So
well, and I think
I'll let you talk, because I've soapboxed that plenty.
No, you're good. And I think if we go really through, for those who don't know the big book, there's hundreds of stories, not hundreds, but dozen and a half stories of people who have cross addictions, people that are probably sex addicts without that term, people who have destroyed their life because of gambling. And I think that singleness of purpose also works in treatment centers. If we circle back to a point we were talking about earlier, where I'm just a mental health therapist, I'm thinking of a story of a practitioner who said, Mike, why are you a trauma therapist doing addiction? You should be an addictions counselor doing addiction, which I immediately thought was the stupidest thing ever, because it's not about singleness of purpose. It's about this integrated, people I think have this hard time with the both and approach, that we cannot wrap our minds of how can two dichotomous things be true at the same point. So I think the willingness for treatment providers, sponsors, and also people genuinely in recovery is we have better outcomes. People stay sober long enough and in recovery long enough if we're willing to not have this rigidity.
As you and I like to say as friends, correct.
So, I know we've been talking for a while. What parts of the mainstream culture have become more open and aware to the idea of trauma? And what kind of ripple effects have you seen in your work?
Well, I do think there's more awareness. For instance, I think of even some TV shows that I watch where, let's say, EMDR has been portrayed, sometimes poorly, where there's storylines that clearly have traumatic components. And I've seen greater depth and characterization over the years in television and movies, to help me see that I think, at least as culture, we're getting a clue about what trauma is and how it affects.
Mm-hmm.
And it can make for good drama. But I do still think there's a lot of hesitancy to go there about healing it, because by and large, as a culture, we are still very feelings phobic.
Amen to
and
that.
a lot of that is no fault of our own, because we've been engendered or in culture or ingrained, yeah, pick a word, that don't talk, don't trust, don't feel are the three proverbial unwritten rules of the alcoholic or dysfunctional home. You may get in trouble if you do any of them. And then there's often very gendered messages around it, especially with men, about boys don't cry, boys are weak if they show this. And so, I mean, I think to get well, we have to do a lot of unpacking around what is the first message we got, that it's not okay to feel our stuff, that it's not okay to get vulnerable, that it's not okay to go there. And even in talking to friends, Mike, I still get just very saddened when people share how afraid they are to talk about feelings. And I'll hear things like, Jamie, you're so good at talking about feelings and communicating. And it's like, well, it's taken a lot of hard work for me to get here. 18 years, technically more, if you consider the years before I had to kind of scrap to figure it out. But I will say, and this might sound like a really crude way of expressing it, but learning to do things like work with my feelings and communicate and go there is why I have lived 18 years past my shelf life. Because I would not be here today if I didn't get on the path that I got on. I mean, I have no doubt in my mind about that. So I'm grateful that I have learned not to be afraid of feeling, of sensation, of just going there.
And I think, if I'm not reading this into this, please correct me, but it's also, you haven't had people who have shamed you for stepping back into an old pattern. And I think creating a culture that is free of shame, whether that's in treatment or a 12-step approach,
Mm-hmm.
and really embracing this, this welcomeness, this open honesty and willingness to embrace the person who suffers and
Mm-hmm.
not accept everything that it comes with, but to validate
Mm-hmm.
and to challenge, to grow, into more adaptive responses.
You bring up an amazing point there, because yes, in 18 years, I certainly have dealt with some shaming, nothing that has totally took me back into the total dark side. But for instance, a point of shame that I have had to address is I have been married and divorced twice in recovery. Not just as someone in recovery, but as a professional, I have been married and divorced twice. And I did a lot of shaming of myself. I mean, there's a lot of just side comments that I received from people over the years about things of that nature. Both partners did their part in shaming me for doing what I needed to do to take care of myself. So I've dealt with it, but I've had more prominently in my life people who have not shamed me, who have allowed me to be my full, authentic, genuine self with them. And that's one of the reasons that my sponsor, Daryl, is currently my sponsor. And I talk about him very prominently in the book. That, and I didn't even know him in 2012 when the first Trauma 12 came out. So he's another just great presence in my life that I've been able to write about in this book. And, I did pick a male to sponsor me about 4 years ago. And I know that there's that traditional ethic of women with women, men with men, but when you're dealing with queer people, it's variable. And for me, a bisexual woman being sponsored by a gay man who is in his late 70s just totally fits. And one of the reasons that I asked Daryl to sponsor me is that he and his husband, Michael, have been out for over 50 years in the state of Ohio. And if we're defining sponsorship as pick the people who have what you want, I want what they have to be, even before they got sober, that comfortable with themselves to take the risk and be out. And that's why I asked Daryl to sponsor me. And we have the relationship where I don't have to hide things from him, and he'll still challenge me. But I don't have to feel this pressure to be like a good recovering girl or a good counselor. The day of my second divorce, I completely melted down in the court and in the hours that followed, and he was there with me, and I was shaming myself for not being able to hold it more together. And he said, Jamie, stop it. Stop it. You're human. And don't ever forget that, because when people forget that is when they end up relapsing after all these years.
And to that point, there's a quote behind me that says, often it's the deepest pain which empowers you to grow to your highest self. And I think
Yes.
that is what Daryl has given you, is being able to embrace what is uncomfortable.
Yes.
And, in the back of the book, you offer a meeting format
Yes.
for people who are looking to embrace both this trauma-informed step. And my understanding is you're also creating a trauma-informed 12-step workbook based on this book. If you
Yes.
could tell us a little bit more about that.
I can. So the meeting format originated from a meeting I started on In the Rooms in 2016. So In the Rooms is just a magnificent resource for people in recovery, especially now during COVID, to be able to access meetings remotely. But Kenny and RT have been doing it for years, even before COVID. And so we started the Trauma and the 12 Steps meeting on In the Rooms in 2006. Due to my own travel and life commitments, I ended up giving it to someone else to take over, a woman named Barbara S., and she does a beautiful job with it. And so, the format is there that we developed for the In the Rooms meeting, and that meeting is still going on Wednesdays at 8:30 Eastern. And so if people want to try hosting a Trauma and the 12 Steps meeting or gathering in their community, obviously it's not affiliated with any 12-step fellowship, that may be a beautiful thing. One thing I will say is some of the best recovery I've gotten in later years has been hanging out with other 12-step people, but doing kind of extracurricular recovery. Like on Thursday nights, I take part in a meditation group. We're online now, and we did it locally even before online. And it's not a meeting, but it's a bunch of 12-steppers getting together to meditate. And it's really beautiful. So in the fall, we don't have an exact release date. My company, Creative Mindfulness Media, which is part of ICM, we're putting out a 12-step workbook and recovery reader. Because I, as I shared with you, the recovery reader was such an important part of me being able to get sober and get set out on this path of lifestyle change, that I had the idea to give people this content in more bite-sized doses day to day, with some teaching, with some actual meditation or expressive arts practice suggestions. And so I was joined by my collaborator and friend, Steve Danziger, who is EMDR faculty member. We've written an EMDR book together. We've just become really good friends through this whole Trauma 12 world and idea. And so he joined me on making both the step workbook and the reader. And our common friend, Anna David, the one who named me EMDR Badass, she was the one who put the idea for the workbook in our head. She said to us, it would be so nice if we had a way to actually work steps with people who have either experienced trauma, or for those of us who are maybe taking a return trip through the steps, to have some different ideas for how we can do that. So stay tuned, as those resources will be coming out.
Thank you. And in the last few minutes, is there anything that we haven't got to that you would want anyone listening to this interview to know about either your approach or how to, trauma-informed 12 steps?
I think we covered a lot of ground. This has been a long interview, truly, but I like it because we got into depth. And I would just encourage people to continue to explore the resources that are available, because even if one meeting isn't working for you, one sponsor, one counselor, just remember to keep trying, because there's as many different varieties of recovery presentation out there as there are people and experiences in the world. And my prayer and my hope for you is that wherever you're at in your journey, you will connect with what you need.
Beautiful. And I would like to point everybody to the Institute for Creative Mindfulness if they're looking to take any trainings or looking to follow more of your work. And thank you for this opportunity to have this interview. And, I have a lot of respect for you and our paths on recovery.
Jai Bhagwan. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.